the philosopher Thomas Hobbes thought of the natural state of human beings as every individual in some sense at the throat of every other individual. So that the basic state of mankind, unlike the Rousseauian state of, say, virgin innocence and the primitive Garden of Paradise, was an all-out war of everyone against everyone else, and that required the imposition of a social order to keep peace, essentially. So it's a fairly dark view of humankind. The postmodern view is like the Hobbesian view in some sense, except you want to replace the individual with pyramids of social organization, so hierarchies of social organization that are based on group identity, and that the landscape in which those pyramids exist is one of unbroken enmity and inability to communicate. So it's a very dark view as far as I'm concerned. It's right in that there are groups of people and there is some difficulty in communication between them, and that power is an element in the formation of hierarchies, but you can't reduce hierarchy or group relationship to those premises. It's too simplified, because people also cooperate. We're also not groups. Many of us belong to many groups. So the actual situation is far too complex to reduce it to that degree. Even though you can come up with a good explanatory story if you do so, it doesn't capture the nuances, and they're not just nuances, it doesn't capture the essence. Now, the thing is that when you make the presupposition that the reason that hierarchies exist is because of power, then essentially what you do is turn every hierarchy into a tyranny. And so if there is a hierarchy, then you assume it's a tyranny. Well, that's really the patriarchy. The patriarchy is hierarchy assumed as tyranny. And that's also just not true, except in pathological hierarchies. So, for example, we know from the psychological literature that the best predictors of long-term life success are intelligence and conscientiousness, in Western countries at least. And, well, that's what you'd hope for, right? You'd more or less, if you wanted even to set up a society, even if you weren't particularly smart or hardworking, you might want to set up a society where intelligence and hard work were good predictors of success, because then the people who were smart and hardworking would produce a bunch of things that you could have if you could trade for them. And of course, that is actually the situation that most of us are in. So, and of course, the other thing about people who believe that hierarchies in the West are only composed of power and tyranny is that their own actions belie that, because whenever they make a decision to interact with that hierarchy, they attempt or to make a purchase or to make a trade, let's say, or to obtain a service of any importance, let's say a medical service, they're going to definitely act as if there are less and more competent people within that hierarchy and seek out the ones that are more competent, obviously, which you don't do if the hierarchy is only composed of tyranny and power. There's no point in looking for competence. But anyways, in the West and in functioning societies, the hierarchies are basically predicated on competence and not power. And you might say, well, that's pretty naive. It's like, no, actually, it's not very naive. I'm not saying at all that inappropriate power plays don't play a role in corrupting hierarchies of competence. That happens, but generally what happens is if the hierarchies of competence get corrupted enough by power, then they crumble because they can no longer function. So, and the evidence that our hierarchies of competence work is everywhere, because everything around us works all the time. Ayaan Hirsi Ali tells two interesting stories in her book Infidel, which is a great book, by the way. She came from Africa and from a country that wasn't very functional, and when she came to Holland, she said there were two things that really amazed her. And this really struck me, because now and then you get lucky and you can see the world you live in from an outsider's perspective, right? You get to see through someone else's eyes. She said the first thing that knocked her off her feet was waiting for a bus in Amsterdam. And on she's standing at the bus stop, and there's a pole there, and there's a digital sign on the pole, and the digital sign says when the next bus is going to come and counts down, and then when it hits 0, the bus appears. And she absolutely could not believe that would happen, that there could be a sign that told you when the bus would come, and that it would change, and the bus would actually appear. And you think, well, yeah, no, that's a miracle, man. That's an absolute miracle. You know, the amount of timing and organization and reliability, mechanical reliability and sociological or social organization and dedication on the part of the bus drivers and the entire company and the organization of the whole city and the state to make that possible is absolutely beyond belief, especially when it's timed to, well, perhaps not the second, but to 10 seconds or something like that. That is absolutely beyond belief. And her inability to comprehend that was the correct response. And then the other thing she was amazed by was that you could go talk to policemen and they would help you. That was just a no-go for her, because for her experience was policemen were there to shake you down and hurt you. And so you think, well, you know, well, I won't dwell on that point any longer. The point is that it's absolutely ridiculous, blind, to make the assumption that the hierarchies in functioning Western democracies are fundamentally predicated on power and tyranny. Frans de Waal, who's a Dutch primatologist, a very smart one too, he's been interested in the biological basis of morality as well. And he's written a lot of good books on primate behavior, chimps in particular. Chimps are brutal creatures, man. Like, they go to war, eh? And so if you have a chimp territory out in the jungle, then the juveniles will, the males in particular, they'll band together in groups of 4 or 5. There's often, but not always, a female or 2 with them. And if they come across chimps from another troop that aren't within their hierarchy, let's say, they will, if they outnumber them, because they can't really count, but they can estimate magnitude visually. It's not the same as counting. But if they outnumber them, they will tear them to pieces. And chimps are at least twice as strong as a really well-developed human male. And so they can tear you up pretty good. And chimps are perfectly capable. They hunt. They're carnivorous, like human beings. And they hunt colobus monkeys often. They weigh about 40 pounds, and they'll basically eat them alive. The monkey's screaming away like mad because, you know, it's in pain because it's being eaten. And that doesn't slow the chimps down a bit. There's no cross-species empathy stopping them from having their snack. And so chimps are very brutal creatures. And it isn't obvious they have a lot of internal inhibition of their aggression at all. Most of the inhibition is sociological. It's out in the hierarchy. And so the reason chimps aren't always aggressive with one another is because they know who can pound them and who will gang up on them and who won't. They establish their hierarchy. Anyways, you know, you think about a chimp hierarchy and you're talking about a fairly strong and aggressive creature. You might think it's biggest, ugliest, meanest, most vicious, irritable, unpleasant chimp that rises to the top. Well, that's kind of the postmodernist view of human society. But that's not the case. It happens sometimes. But what happens, and de Waal has documented this quite nicely, is that tyrant chimps lead unstable regimes. Now, you know, that might sound familiar, because the same thing, of course, is true of human beings. And why is that? Well, it's because, you know, people don't like tyrants, and chimps don't like them that much either. And chimps are actually quite reciprocal in their social interactions. So they don't just dominate each other, they groom each other, they have friendships, they contract social relationships over very long periods of time. You know, and they do that. And so they engage in reciprocal interactions, let's say pro-social reciprocal interactions. And you might think, well, what's the weak point of the biggest, ugliest, toughest chimp in the troop? And that is, he doesn't have any friends. And so, you know, maybe he has a bad day. He's a little hungover or whatever from eating fermented bananas or whatever he is partying with. And 2 of the slightly less ugly, slightly less mean chimps decide, well, this is a good time to take him out, and they tear him to pieces. And so one of the things de Waal has pointed out quite nicely is that if you want to have a stable chimp dominance hierarchy, let's call it a regime, the stable ones aren't ruled by the tyrants, because the tyrants get taken out by paired up friendship dyads, something like that. So that's really worth thinking about too, you know, because it indicates that even in creatures that have less complex sociological orders, And they do, because one of the things that predicts how complex your social order is how big your brain is compared to your body. It's encephalization, essentially. And the more encephalized a creature, the larger the social groups it can track. And of course, human beings are very highly encephalized, so we have quite complicated group organizations. But even in simpler group organizations like the chimps, it isn't the tyrant who rules stably. And that turns out to be also incredibly important. Okay, so so much for the idea that power is the only game in town. Then you got to ask the question is, well, this is actually a postmodern question. So, one of the things Derrida said, the main postmodern joker, is that by categorizing, you privilege one concept and you force other concepts out to the margins. And so he believed that when you constructed a hierarchy of power, the hierarchy of power privileged certain people and marginalized others. And that's really not that brilliant an observation as far as I'm concerned. It's rather commonplace. All it means is that when you categorize something, that there are things that are in the category and a bunch of things that aren't. And so you actually can't categorize anything, which means you can't perceive anything, which means you can't think or live without making some things in the middle and everything else on the outside. It's part of categorization itself. And so maybe the postmodernists would go far enough to question the utility of categorization itself, and I think to some degree they do that. But the point here is that if you have to ask why it is that you would, if you were a postmodernist yourself, why it is that you would privilege the idea of power above all else. It's exactly what is it that you're pushing to the margin.